So we're now continuing with part one of our section on violence in human nature. Last time we talked about what makes a characteristic part of an individual's nature. This time we'll talk about what makes a characteristic part of a species' nature, and then put those two together to talk about what makes violence part of human nature, if it is. So here's a proposal. A characteristic is part of a species' nature if it's part of any one member's nature. Well, this proposal faces a serious problem, which is that individuals have characteristics that are part of their nature, but not part of human nature. Let's take Antonio Alfonseca here. If you look closely, you'll see that he has 6 fingers on each hand. Antonio's having 6 fingers is part of his nature. It was controlled by his genes. It's not the result of his environment, but it's not part of human nature. After all, the vast majority of us don't have 6 fingers on each hand. So we can't say that a characteristic is part of human nature if it's part of at least one member's nature. That is, being part of one member's nature is not sufficient for being part of human nature. What about this? Being part of every member's nature. A characteristic is part of a species' nature if it's part of every member's nature. Well, we run into the same problem. Having 5 fingers is part of human nature, but it's not part of Antonio's nature. Of course, Antonio is human, so being part of every member's nature can't be necessary for being part of a species' nature. Okay, how about this? A characteristic is part of a species' nature if it results from a member's nature in a member, and a large majority of individuals in the species share that member's nature. Okay, let's now consider fingers. Well, having 5 fingers is part of Jennifer's nature. That is, it's the result of her genes. And a large majority of humans share that aspect of Jennifer's nature. So, by this specification, having 5 fingers is part of human nature. That doesn't mean that every human has 5 fingers, but it does mean that having 5 fingers is part of human nature. And that seems plausible. It seems like it's characterizing this example correctly. Okay, let's put these two together. That is our specification of what it is for a characteristic to be part of an individual's nature, and our specification of what it is for a characteristic to be part of a species' nature together to get a sense of what we mean when we say that violence is part of human nature. So, according to the first specification, a characteristic is part of an individual's nature if and only if, that's what the IFF stands for, if and only if there's a wide range of circumstances in which that characteristic will show little variation, but a narrow range of circumstances in which it will show a lot of variation. This is the specification we talked about in the previous video. Now, a characteristic is part of a species' nature if and only if it results from an individual member's nature and a large majority of individuals in the species share that nature. So let's put these together, and what do we get? Well, we get a first-pass specification of the claim that violence is part of human nature. This specification holds that violence is part of human nature if and only if there is a wide range of circumstances in which a large majority of humans will frequently behave violently toward one another, but a narrow range of circumstances in which even a small minority of humans won't frequently behave violently towards one another. And this looks like a reasonable kind of hypothesis, one that we can test. Now, of course, there's vagueness, and the vagueness is important. What is it for a range to be wide? What does large majority here mean? Do we mean, what they consider a large majority in politics, like 55%, or what we consider a large majority in many other contexts, like 80%? What about frequently? We say humans will frequently behave violently towards one another. Does that mean every minute? Does it mean once a day? Does it mean once every 6 months? And then we have the same problems with narrow range that we have with wide range. We have the same problem with significant minority that we have with large majority. And we have the same problem with frequently here, obviously. Now, this vagueness makes the definition or the specification non-ideal, but we're just going to leave the specification vague and try and make sure that the vagueness doesn't interfere with the way that we're classifying things, with the way that we're thinking about whether violence is part of human nature. So this is the specification that we'll use. This is the claim that will be sort of on the table. So when we say Hobbes thinks that violence is part of human nature, we're saying he thinks that there is a wide range of circumstances in which a large majority of humans will frequently behave violently towards one another, but a narrow range in which they won't. And when we say that Zinn thinks there's no evidence that violence is part of human nature, we're saying he thinks there's no evidence that this claim is true. Okay. Next time, we're going to shift and look at Hobbes's view, look at his arguments, his reasons for thinking that this claim is true, that there's a wide range of circumstances in which humans will regularly behave violently towards one another, but a narrow range in which they won't.